Hello, my name is Justin Coffey, and this is my submission for Module 4 in Special Education for Building Administrators. And in Module 4, I interviewed 3 different special education professionals. And the first person that I interviewed was Max Diaz, and he's a special education paraprofessional at Lynn Elementary in Dodge City. He has 3 years of experience with elementary special education, and Max is a former student of mine that I had when he was in high school. I also interviewed Jose Martinez, and Jose Martinez is a special education teacher at Dodge City High School, and he has 6 years of experience as a special education teacher, and he's a former colleague of mine. And then finally, I also interviewed Mark Paul, and Mark Paul is the high school principal at Ulysses High School, and he is actually the principal I'll be working for, as I will be his assistant principal starting in the fall. He has 6 years of experience as a high school principal. So the first question that I asked my 3 personnel was, how are students identified for special education? And Max didn't have too much of an idea. He thought that identification comes from recommendations from either parents or teachers, but he wasn't for sure on how students get put into special education. Jose Martinez said that for the most part, his students are already identified as special education by the time that they get to the high school. He talked about how there are few students who are identified as special needs when they're in the high school. Most of them are already identified. And so he did say that the high school does have a SIT team, and there's a process that teachers can use to start the identification for students, but that it's rarely used at the high school. Mark Paul talked about the process for identifying students, and he says that in the Ulysses district, they utilize interventions, and that helps them collect data and gain an understanding for a student's abilities. And then a student is identified through classroom teachers. And then there's a team that looks at the data and looks at the individual student. And that team is ultimately responsible for making the recommendation for special education. I asked my 3 friends, what is the most challenging part about their role? And they all had 3 different answers. Max talked about how he's assigned pretty much to one student throughout the day. And so he works with that student closely. He talked a little bit about his how his student has autism and a few other issues, and he works with him. And he said the hardest part is keeping that student on task throughout the day and focused, and figuring out the best way to help that student. Jose talked about the most challenging part of his job as a special education teacher is time management. He talked about all the different responsibilities and roles that he plays as a special education teacher, and balancing his time between paperwork and serving students and planning. He also team teaches a class, and so all of those things, he has a lot of tasks that he needs to get done throughout the day, and managing his time is the most difficult part. Mark Paul, the principal, talked about how sometimes teachers struggle with students with special needs. And so either helping them make sure that they're using the accommodations that are outlined in the IEP, or sometimes these students cause classroom disruptions or behaviors, and helping teachers learn how to manage student behavior and helping teachers learn how to best help these students with special needs. He spends quite a bit of time helping teachers with that. I also asked these 3 what the most rewarding aspect of their role is. And Max said that his most rewarding part is when he's able to work one-on-one with his student, and when the student is struggling and Max is able to help him either complete that assignment or learn about the concept that they're learning about, and seeing the student be successful. Jose mentioned that kind of the same thing. He likes it when he's able to work one-on-one with students, or when he's able to team teach a class and helping students be successful. But he went in a little bit further to talk about Yes, he likes helping students be successful academically, but he also really likes the opportunity to talk with students and teach them about life skills and maybe some of the more social emotional needs of students and how he can help them be successful later on in life. That's his most rewarding part. And then Mark Paul talked about the most rewarding part for his role is when he hands out diplomas on graduation day and realizing the distance that some of those students were able to travel to be successful and graduate from high school. I asked them what advice they had for supervision of special education staff, and I got some interesting answers. Max talked about the need for more training. He said that his special education teacher provided him some really basic training, but a lot of times he feels like he's not exactly sure what he needs to do. And he feels like he could use some more training about how to help his student. Jose Martinez talked about he likes to feel appreciated. And so his advice would be to, when you see a teacher doing well or you see someone working hard, to thank them for their time and their effort and just giving some appreciation every once in a while. He thinks that really helps with the supervision of special education staff. He doesn't feel like they're always appreciated. And then Mark Paul talked about supporting the teachers, having high expectations, but supporting them to make sure that they meet those expectations. Another question that I asked these three is how they work effectively with parents. And Max talked about how he doesn't have too much interaction with parents. So a lot of times he just works with the students, and sometimes the parents may call or visit with the special education teacher or the classroom teacher, and those teachers will kind of pass information along to Max, but he doesn't personally call parents, or they don't personally call him. So and his student rides the bus, so he doesn't really see the parents at the end of the day. So he doesn't have much interaction at all with the parents. Jose talked about how communication is key for working with parents. He talked about how he tries to make positive contact with parents, especially early in the year, to kind of build a rapport and a relationship with parents. And then when he needs to make tougher phone calls or talk about tough situations, he feels like those early conversations that were positive helps make those conversations go a little more smoothly. So communication, he talked about always communicating with parents and making sure that they're in the loop about what's happening with their student. Finally, Mr. Paul talked about listening. And he said that a lot of times when we listen to respond, and we don't necessarily listen to understand. So he talked about the importance of listening to actually understand, because sometimes a parent, he is talking about sometimes a parent doesn't necessarily use the best way to communicate. Sometimes they're aggressive or upset. But if we actually listen to what they're trying to say, then we can find solutions. So he talked about the importance of listening when you're working with parents. Another question that I asked is, how do you work with regular ed teachers? And so Max talked about how he works super closely with the classroom teacher for his student, because he's in that classroom pretty much all day. And so he has to have a really good idea about what's happening in class and how he can help his student. And a lot of times he said that he's kind of the communication piece for his student. So he's the one who will talk to the teacher based on the student's needs to make sure that the student is getting what they need, because his student is not always able to communicate what he needs. So Max kind of has to act as the student's voice. Jose talked about how important communication is with parents, but he also talked about how important communication is with the regular ed teachers. So he tries to communicate regularly once a week. He tries to visit the classroom teacher in person, face to face, rather than just through an email, to try and really get a feel for how his students are doing in the class so that he can help support those students. And then he also team teaches the class. And so especially with that regular ed teacher, he works really closely in planning lessons and making sure that the students in that class are accommodated. Along those same lines, Mr. Paul talked about the importance of communication between special ed and regular ed teachers, and communicating about strategies or techniques that might work or might be successful for a student is really important. So sometimes he was saying special ed teachers know their students really well and they know what's worked in the past, and they might be able to communicate some of those tips or tricks or strategies to the regular ed classroom to help the student be successful in that classroom. And finally, I asked these three what characteristics they seek in aspiring administrators. So I was asking a little bit of personal advice here. If I were to be their administrator, what characteristics would they seek? And so Max talked about he likes his administrator in his building, and he says that he thinks a good administrator gets to know their staff and students and encourage everyone to be their best. So he feels like the principal in his building does that. He feels like she knows who he is and she has conversations with him, and she encourages him to be his best. And the same thing with students in the building. Jose Martinez also had great things to say about his principal. He likes his principal because she gives him space to do his job without necessarily breathing down her neck or always checking in with him. She gives him a little bit of space and trusts him to do his job. But at the same time, when he needs support, when he is struggling or he's not sure what to do or he has questions, she's there to support him. So he thinks that that's a great characteristic for a principal. And finally, Mark Paul talked about the administrators need to prioritize time. He talked about how a lot of times you'll have a plan for the day and you'll kind of schedule out what you need to get done that day. And he said more times than not, those plans get blown up and they don't work out. And that a lot of times you have to scrap those plans for the day. And so he talked about being able to, once you have to scrap those plans, reorganize your time and prioritize what's most important and what needs to get finished and what can wait till tomorrow or the next day. And he thinks that that's an important characteristic when you're an aspiring administrator. And he thinks that that can really help with special education too, because some things need immediate attention and some things can wait for a day or two. So those were my interviews, and I really had a great time with this module. I learned a lot from all three of the interviews. It was fun to get to talk to my former student and a former colleague and my new boss. So I really got a lot out of the module, and I appreciate you your time and interest in this subject. Thank you.